In today's Sunday video, we continue the series on the wrecks of Kure, the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy, if you want to look at it that way. In this video, we'll be looking at another of the cruiser wrecks, in this case Tone, a unique design to say the least. All of her main battery was concentrated forward to free up the stern for dedicated floatplane support. That will be very apparent when looking at the wreck. Although, before we touch on that, we'll need to look at her sinking, or at least where that differs from the other wrecks previously covered in this little series. In Tone's case, that saw her back in Japan on November 17th, 1944, where the cruiser was put in for extensive repair work to damage she suffered at Leyte Gulf. Most critically, a bomb hit to her stern that had temporarily disabled her steering. The repairs for this and other damage lasted into February of 1945, specifically February 18th. Tone left dry dock on that day with her repairs completed and additional anti-aircraft guns fitted. Although, after leaving dock, the cruiser wouldn't go far. Tone would remain in Japan after being reassigned as a training ship, before then shifting to Kure as most of the fleet did. She moored there on February 20th, 1945, where most of the crew was taken off for other duties. The cruiser would not leave again, because soon after, the first bombing raid struck. That was March 19th, 1945, and Tone would not escape damage. The cruiser would be hit directly by one bomb that jammed the number 3 turret. Several other near misses caused minor flooding, but nothing much beyond that. The turret damage was certainly the worst, even if Tone wasn't exactly putting it to use. There would be worse damage, however, on July 24th, 1945. Much like other Japanese ships, Tone would be focused down in this raid. Up to 100 aircraft attacked her over the course of the day, with 3 to 4 direct hits, and up to 7 near misses. The combination of these hits caused severe flooding, forcing the Japanese to beach the cruiser. This wasn't the end of it either. While Tone was out of the war at this point, she wouldn't be ignored in the follow-up attack on July 28th. American aircraft descended upon the beached cruiser. Tone's gunners, to their credit, fought back hard, but it wasn't enough. Another 2 direct hits and a handful of near misses followed. This caused yet more flooding, and this time the Japanese couldn't do anything about it. The best they could do was reduce the list and have the cruiser settle at a relatively shallow angle, and a shallow depth for that matter. Either way, Tone was on the bottom, a position she would remain in with the war coming to its end. There were no plans, so far as I'm aware, to even attempt salvaging the ship. Instead, the cruiser was left in place, at least for a couple years. The scrapping process on Tone began relatively late, with the first work starting on April 7th of 1947. This involved removing the superstructure and turrets to lighten the wreck. This process, along with sealing holes, ran for about a year, with Tone's hulk refloated on May 4th, 1948, which allowed her to be towed off for proper scrapping beginning at the end of September 1948. Unfortunately, I haven't found any images I can confirm relate to the scrapping. I was, however, able to find a few pictures of the wreck itself. Let's begin with this one, taken from the water. It's a nice side shot focused on the bow. The first thing that jumps out, of course, is how low in the water the wreck is. Only the extreme forward end of the ship is above the surface. As far forward as the turrets, Tone's deck is submerged. While Tone had been beached, the water was still deep enough to settle into as she sank. That said, the parts above water are in decent enough shape. 3 of the 4 bow turrets are in frame, and all of them are in one piece, at least from this angle. The 4th turret, right ahead of the bridge, is harder to make out, although we'll get a better look at that later. As for the other turrets, we can see an open entrance on the back of the number 1 turret, and the barbette of the number 2 turret as well. There aren't many more details there, so let's move to the superstructure. This is also pretty intact from this angle. There's no visible damage, like say Hyuga. The bridge tower is fine, and the bridge itself is recognizable. Even the funnel behind it is still in one piece, which is impressive. Those aren't thick metal, yet there's no sign of major damage, at least in this picture. The same goes for the gun tubs, here and here. You can even make out one of the secondary battery mounts, although that's easier to see when you colorize the image, along with the mottled green camouflage paint. However, I think the best thing this color image does is show the catapult here. It's the only part of the stern aircraft deck, the main feature of the Tone design, still above water. The rest of the area is completely submerged, which is more apparent here. This is a nice close-in look at the stern. Unfortunately, the quality of the image doesn't show much. We can see that catapult quite clearly, as well as the masts and the back of the bridge, and the very little of the aircraft deck above water here, as well as a look at one of the turrets on the bow. Everything else is a bit too dark to make out much detail. You can barely make out the secondary battery here, but you can't see it very well. The same goes for the funnel and the bridge above it. This lack of detail is doubly unfortunate because this is the only close-in look from the stern that I was able to find. The other 2 shots are from further out, like this one, which shows the list of the cruiser, as well as the back of the funnel in better detail. The best part of this one, however, is the waterline. It's another example of how Tone is barely above the surface. If she were any deeper, only the superstructure would be visible. As it is, most of the deck is still underwater. The last picture from the stern, meanwhile, is the midpoint between the other 2. Further out than the first, but closer in than the second. It's also arguably the best overall look at the ship from this angle. I can't say it's the best look at the stern itself, if only because there's basically none of that above the water level. This seems to be at an even higher tide than in the previous pictures. What this does show us, on the other hand, is the secondary battery. Tone had 4 twin mounts for the Japanese 127mm 5-inch dual-purpose gun. 2 twins on either side of the ship, and you can make out 2 of them here. At least the parts that are still visible, as well as the parts of the superstructure around the funnel above them. You can also make out the bridge windows here. Not much beyond that, though, because it's too far out. This is also one of the few good looks we get at Turret 3 and maybe Turret 4, although only for a certain value of good look. Most of it is still pretty hard to make out. There's not much else to say, though, so let's move on. The remaining pictures, with one exception, are all close-in looks. We'll begin here with another side shot. This is right next to the funnel, which gives us a good look at it. This is the classic Japanese style with the serpentine trunking. There's also more apparent damage when you look at it from this angle. The funnel is split here with the metal bowed out. It also looks like there's some fire damage towards the top, yet the searchlight next to it is still in place. It makes for an interesting contrast. As for the secondary battery, those are both in place as well. One pointing ahead and one pointing out over the side. The one pointing ahead is the better look because of the angle of the image. This is actually one of the better surviving pictures in that regard. You don't see the secondary battery on Japanese cruisers very often, especially not from this close in. Beyond that, however, the pattern continues. Most of the hull is beneath the surface and hidden out of sight. The water's even reached up far enough to almost cover a boat davit here. The only other notable bits above water are the masts and the superstructure. And for their part, the masts are mostly out of frame. The superstructure, meanwhile, is visible here, including what looks like fire control equipment, most likely for the secondary battery. With that covered, let's move forward. The next two pictures are both of Tone's bow. The first one shows more detail, mostly of the turrets. Like the last couple pictures, the cruiser is deeper in the water here. By this point, almost the entire bow is beneath the surface, with only the tip still above the water. Even the number 1 turret is starting to go under, which is saying something. That aside, there are a couple interesting notes. First, the barrels and orientation of the turrets. The number 1 turret has its barrels elevated and pointed astern. This might have been to engage aircraft, although that's hard to say with any certainty. The number 2 turret, meanwhile, is still facing forward, with the barrels at a flat angle. The number 3 and 4 turrets aren't visible in this picture. On the other hand, you can see some of the equipment on the bow here, and a better look at the bridge. You still can't make out anything inside of it, but the actual structure, windows and all, is pretty clear. The next picture, meanwhile, is from directly ahead. There's only a couple things to note here. First, the bow itself, where we can see the Imperial chrysanthemum proudly in place, and also an anchor reaching into the water here. Moving up from there, we get another look at the bridge. This one is mostly good for showing the area without shrouding it in darkness. And finally, we can see boats nearby, including people boarding the wreck here, which is a good point to move to the second to last picture, which seems to be from the same time. It looks like occupation forces boarding the cruiser to examine her hulk. However, there's only really 2 other things to this picture beyond those visitors. First, the deck above water. This is the best glance we get from this close. And beyond that, we also have the turrets. This is the only look we get at the back of the second turret. And for that matter, the only good look we get at the third turret at all. Both are pretty much intact and still fixed on the center line. As we move into the final picture, that will not apply to turret 4. This is a look from above, which is also the only real glance we get at the final turret, which is intact but pointing out slightly to the side. This picture is also the best look we get at the deck as a whole, although even here, there's not much in the way of detail. So with that, let's round the video off. Tone is an interesting ship and an interesting wreck. Her distinctive features are apparent, even with half of it underwater. And she's also one of the most intact of the Kure wrecks, which makes her ultimate refloating rather less surprising. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.